So picture firefighters in a fire hall. And so the key with how they have everything set up is readiness, right? And so everything is structured so that as soon as they get a call, they can go out as quick as possible. And so the reason that there's a fire pole is so from the second or the third floor, they can get down quickly. The truck is always prepped, full of gas. The doors, as you can see from that picture, are even open, right, to save time. Their helmets in their back, exact specific place. But you'll notice also the pants and the boots are together. And I am the assistant coach of one of Ben's hockey teams, and one of the other assistant coaches is a firefighter. I was like, hey, could you send me a great close-up picture of the boots and the pants so we can see it? And so here's what it is. And you'll notice it's like it's all together as one unit. So you go to the truck, you jump into the boots, you take the straps and you pull them up, and all of a sudden, all your gear is on. It's so amazing how quick this is. And the focus is readiness, readiness, readiness. Well, we're in the season of Advent. This is the 4-week season leading up to the birth of Christ. And as we've talked about, the word Advent comes from a Latin word meaning coming or arrival. And this makes sense because we're thinking about the coming of Christ at Christmas, the first coming. But historically, this is also a time when we think about the second coming, the return of Jesus, his second coming. And so today we're going to look at a passage that's actually going to help us do both. So in one respect, prepare our hearts and minds to remember and to celebrate the arrival, the coming of Christ at Christmas, but also to think about the second coming. How do we prepare ourselves for the return of Jesus? And we're going to look at a text in the Gospel of Matthew. But before we do that, I thought we should back up a little bit because the return of Jesus, or the second coming, the second Advent, is something we know. It's in the Bible. We speak about it in the Creed. Maybe we've heard some things about it, but we sometimes struggle with the question, why? Why is he returning? So there's a lot that can be said. I'm just going to highlight 4 big picture things so we're all on the same page before we jump into the text. So here they are. First, Jesus will return as Judge and Saviour. So these are 2 very key terms. He will judge evil and darkness fully and finally, and he will come as Savior. He will reward faithfulness. Okay, that's probably one of the things that's most commonly held. Second, this will mark the end of human history as we know it. So we are in a certain period of human history that will mark the end. I'm not sure if it was high school, university, there was a REM song. It's the end of the world as we know it, right? I'm pretty sure the end of the world is going to be different than a 90s rock band envisions. Nevertheless, the end of human history as we know it. Third, Jesus will usher in a new heavens and a new earth. And so this is one of the aspects of the return of Jesus that is maybe talked about the least or misunderstood. So the idea is that Jesus will usher in this new heavens and the new earth. And as we learn in Revelation 21, this is a place where every tear will be wiped from every eye. The Apostle Peter says that it is a place where righteousness dwells. So this is the renewal and renovation of all things to restore them to how they were originally intended to be. So when you think back to the Garden of Eden, everything is perfect, then sin and brokenness enters into the world. The new heavens and the new earth is the restoration, in a sense, of Eden. Fourth, we don't know when it will happen. People try to guess. We don't know when it will happen. Jesus says this very specifically in Matthew 24:36. We do not know the day or the hour. Okay, so having said that, let's go back to Matthew's gospel. And I want to spend a moment just reminding us who this is. Who is Matthew? Because this bears on the trustworthiness of the accounts and just for us to orient ourselves about who we're listening to. So Matthew was one of the first disciples of Jesus. So he's an eyewitness. He walks and talks with Jesus. He was a Jew. He would have been familiar with the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, what we commonly call the Old Testament. So he's there. Jesus says, follow me. And Matthew was a tax collector. And so he would have had additional training for that. So he's really in a very unique position to record the things that Jesus says and does, right? So let's say you are spending every day with someone and you come to realize, wait a second, this person is actually the long-awaited Messiah, the coming King. You're going to start to write down what he says and does as well. And so Matthew does that. Now, chapters 24 and 25 include many instructions by Jesus, from Jesus' mouth, about his return. What are some of the things to expect? What are the things that are going to be going on? What are the signs leading up to that? And in chapter 25, it's called the Parable of the 10 Virgins. He spends 13 verses, and he talks about various aspects of this in other places as well, but he spends these 13 verses talking about how we are to live in the meantime while we wait. What are we to be spending our time doing as we await for the return of Jesus. And so if we could capture this in a word, it would be readiness. It's about readiness. There was this boy, and he had an illness, and he was going to die. It was terminal. This does happen, very sad, especially with children. But he had this wish, this what we might call a dying wish. He wanted to meet President Dwight Eisenhower. And so this was a while ago. Eisenhower is the 34th American president. His tenure was mostly over the 1950s. Somehow the word actually gets to Eisenhower, and unannounced, he shows up at the boy's house, the family's house. He shows up there. And the boy's just blown away. I can't believe it. This is such an amazing day, and he's dealing with all this adversity and illness. But, the president of America comes to his house. So this story obviously gets out. It's in the papers. But another aspect of the story came out later. There was someone who wasn't really that impressed with the timing, and that was the dad. Because he didn't shave that day. He's like, here the American president comes to my house, and I look like this sketchy guy who stayed like 3 nights in a cheap motel. It's like, what's going on here? But let me tell you this, meeting a president or a prime minister or a king or a queen or the most famous celebrity, artist, influencer, news person, whatever, is nothing compared to meeting the King of Kings, right? Now, whether or not you have shaved, whether or not you've put on makeup properly, all those sorts of things, they will not matter. However, other things will matter. What are they? So to explore this, we're going to open the flesh of the text. This is the beautiful and majestic Word of God, and we're going to start at Matthew 25, reading from the ESV, verse 1. And as we listen to this parable of the 10 virgins, just remember that this comes from Jesus, and it's about readiness, because he loves us. He cares for us, so he shares this for us because he wants us to be ready. Out of his loving concern, he does not want us to be caught off guard. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. So right out of the gate, we're told that this is about the kingdom of heaven. So when we hear the word heaven, sometimes we think, oh, that's heaven, the afterlife, and sometimes. But the kingdom of heaven, called the kingdom of God in Mark and Luke, and sometimes John, is really where and when God rules as king, kingdom. Where and when God rules as king. So this is in this life. It's also in the afterlife, obviously. Where and when God rules as king, so in our own personal lives and relationships, but also in the wider world. So then there's a mention of a bridegroom. So this tells us that in the parable that Jesus is about to teach us, he's using the structure of a wedding banquet. Okay, a wedding. So that's kind of the clue about what that is. Now, weddings in first century Judea, first century Jewish weddings were a little bit different than weddings that happen now. Today, we're all mixed up about weddings for a variety of reasons. I was talking with this young lady recently, and she was saying, my fiance and I have delayed our wedding because we just can't afford it yet. And I was like, if we need to delay weddings because they become these crazy things that we can't even afford, I think we're focusing on the wrong things. That's a question for another day. We all know it's true. But anyway, so a couple of things were different, many things were different about first century Jewish weddings, and they didn't always necessarily happen in the same way. But I think this bit of context and background is helpful. So the wedding ceremony itself often happened in the bride's family's house. And not always, but often. And then what would happen is they would travel then to the groom's house to have the after party, the celebration. And they hadn't really got their own house yet because they're younger, tend to be more younger, getting married than people now. And so they probably would have started their married lives in the groom's house because he really can't afford his own house yet. So they stay there until he can afford a house. Then they move there. But the idea is that sometimes at that first part of the wedding itself, there's a delay between then and when they go to the groom's house, his father's house, for the reception. And so that's the idea. And so on the night of the wedding, outside where the reception, the party is going to be, there's these 10 virgins. Now, this is not necessarily a comment about their sexuality, whether or not they've had sex before, although that is certainly also the case. They are young. They're probably in their teens. They probably know the bride. They're probably thinking about their own marriage, on the horizon. But they are there and they're waiting. And there can be a delay sometimes because this is before the internet. So it's not like you can text or jump on a WhatsApp chat, say, hey, we're 25 minutes or an hour and a half delayed. They just have to wait. And because it's a wedding, it's a celebration, it's at night. Okay, so all of this is in the background, and they have lamps. So think of more like torches. Some of your translations will say a torch. So think of a stick, a cloth wrapped around, dipped in some sort of oil, to illuminate the sky in the darkness, right? So that's the idea here. So 5 of them are foolish and 5 are wise. So right away, we're being told that we want to emulate 5 of them, the wise ones, and not emulate the 5 foolish ones. So that's the orientation to the story in the parable. Verse 3, for when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. Okay, so some are preparing, some are not. They won't be able to see in the dark if they haven't prepared their lamps and have enough oil. Verse 5. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at night there was a cry, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Okay, so this is the moment they've all been waiting for. The party is about to start. So notice some key details. Details matter. This happens at midnight. And so what does Paul say about the return of Jesus in 1 Thessalonians 5? He will come like a thief in the night. Right. So the reason I point that out is because when we look at passages like this, there are touch points, crossover details with other stories on a similar topic. So in this case, about the return of Jesus. Not only that, but we're told that there will be a cry, here he comes. So, okay, Paul also says in that same letter, there'll be a cry of command, the voice of the archangel, the trumpet call of God. In the previous chapter, in Matthew 24, Jesus also mentions a trumpet. So I think as we read through the New Testament, we're saying, oh, wait a second, these details overlap. This is about the return of Jesus. Verse 7. Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps, right? So they've been waiting and they've got lamps. This is refueling, so to speak, right? The oil is running out. Verse 8, and the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves. Now, when modern readers read this story, they think, that doesn't sound nice. If they're wise, shouldn't they be generous? Shouldn't they be kind? Well, remember, this isn't really about a first century Jewish wedding, nor is it really about lamps and oil. So might it be the case that this is something that couldn't be shared even if they wanted to? Okay, so hold on to that detail. We're going to return to that in a moment. Verse 10, and while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. And so while they're going away to get more oil, to refuel, so to speak, the bridegroom returns, and the wise are there, and they all go in, and the door was shut. Let's not miss the gravity of those words. And the door was shut. The door was shut. Ka-kunk. Verse 11, afterward the other virgins came also saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. And so the foolish virgins return and they cry out, Lord, Lord. Now, it's interesting because this exact phrase, not only in English, but in the original Greek, occurs earlier in the same gospel, in the gospel according to Matthew. It happens in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, it is so similar that you think that's what Jesus says in chapter 7 is actually a commentary on what's really happening here in chapter 25. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So brothers and sisters, let me say something to you, and I pray to God that you hear it in the spirit in which it is received. It is one thing to know about Jesus. It is another thing to know Jesus. It is one thing to know about Jesus. It is another thing to know Jesus. It's one thing, I know about the guy who works at store such and such. But do I know him? Well, not necessarily, right? And so think of any relationship. For it's going to grow, if it's going to be real and authentic, you need to spend time with that person. You need to build intimacy. And this isn't about romance. Any kind of relationship where you need to build intimacy, you talk with them, they talk with you, you learn about them, they learn about you, you spend time, you invest in them, you welcome them into your experiences so they really get to know you. That's what's going on here. The same thing is true in a relationship with Christ. Pastor and author John Thompson writes, the problem is never God's availability, but ours. The problem is never God's availability, but ours. And the bridegroom says to them, I do not know you. And again, this seems harsh. And so this really isn't about a first century Jewish wedding or virgins or oil or lamps. He did not know them like he knew the others for some reason. He did not know them like he knew the others. He did not know them like he knew the others. Verse 13, watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Now in the last verse of the parable, it's very lovely. Jesus tells us very specifically what this is about. So you don't know the day or the hour. About what? About when the bridegroom is going to return. Clearly that's what it means. So therefore we need to watch. Now this is a Greek word that could be translated stay alert. I did a word study on this recently, and it's amazing how many times this concept comes up in the teachings about the return of Jesus. Watch, stay alert, watch, be on guard. So think of the ancient world of watchmen. An ancient walled city, and there's a castle inside, and there's these watchmen. They stand on the walls, and their job is to keep on the lookout for what is happening for the benefit of the people inside. And I think that's a helpful thing for us to keep in mind. Watch, be alert, for you do not know the day or the hour. But of course, what are we really looking for? What do we need to be doing? What's the deal with the oil in the lamps? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So let's look at some of the different things that the story represents. So for me, having studied this story, I think there's some comparisons and connections that we can use to fill in the blank. So I'd like to highlight some of them. First of all, who is the bridegroom? Well, I think very obviously that's Jesus. Okay? Now, his return to the wedding is really about the second coming. The language is being used to communicate that to us. The wedding feast itself, that's the new heavens and the new earth. That's where everything is restored and everyone is rejoicing and there's peace and harmony yet again. That's the wedding celebration itself. Now, the opening and the closing of the door, that's the judging and saving of Jesus. Some are able to come in, and some are kept out. Now, the wise virgins, I believe, represent genuine disciples. These are genuine followers of Jesus. So you can go to your friends and family this week and say, the pastor at church said we needed to act like wise virgins. And your friends will be like, what kind of crazy church are you going to? That sounds weird. But then the foolish virgins are pretend disciples. And I'm using that phrase because it means either their faith is insincere or maybe they have not kept at it over the long haul. But the key to this parable is the lamps and the oil. What's the deal there? Now, I think the lamps are simply an extension of the person themselves. So the real crux is the oil. What is the deal afterward? After all, whether you go in or whether you're kept out depends on what happens with the oil. That is critical. So I'm going to suggest that the oil represents three things all at once, and then I'm going to explain why. And here they are. The oil represents faith, loving action, and perseverance. Faith, loving action, and perseverance. Now, earlier I said when we looked at that certain verse, we thought, that's not fair. Some of those foolish virgins, they wanted some of that oil, and the wise ones said, no, go get some for yourself. Well, maybe it was because it wasn't really about oil, because faith, loving action, and perseverance are things that you need to cultivate from within. Someone else can't give them to you. So let's say, Val, I say like, Val, sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm like, I really think you're a patient person and wonderful. And, no matter what you face, you're always very patient. Could I have some of your patience? And she'd be like, don't be ridiculous. I can give you $10. I can give you a ride downtown, but I can't, give you patience. You have to cultivate that from within. Well, the same thing is happening in this parable. It's not that the wise virgins are not being kind. It's just that the things that this is really about are things you cultivate from the inside. Faith, loving action, perseverance. Let me explain why I think they are all in the oil, metaphorically in the parable, at the same time. First, faith. So when the German reformer Martin Luther looked at this parable and studied it, he said, yeah, the oil definitely represents faith. And I would agree with him because faith underpins everything that Jesus says in the entire Gospel of Matthew. And this isn't a general faith. I know something about Jesus. No, it's knowing Jesus. And so it's like, okay, I'm trusting who he is and what he has done for me. So that makes sense. Second, loving action. Notice that I've not put the word love in there because we always get so confused about the idea of love. It's not a feeling, it's loving action. So the words in the New Testament, agapao, the verb, this is about doing things for the good of people who are made in the image of God, often in a way that is self-sacrificial. We've talked about that definition before. It's loving action. Now, why would I think that? Because of the language Jesus uses. A lamp gives light. Okay? A lamp gives light. And Jesus had said something very specifically about light earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. It's one of the most famous lines from the Sermon on the Mount. In chapter 5, verse 16, he says, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds, good works, and give glory to your Father in heaven." So Jesus elsewhere associates good deeds and light, right? And the oil helps the lamps have light. So not only that, but in the chapter previous, in chapter 24, Jesus specifically says, in the period leading up to his return, the love of many will grow cold. So in the wider unbelieving world, there will be less and less godly love in the world. And so we need especially to retain this loving action as the people of God. So first, faith; second, loving action; third, perseverance. And this is simply because it's evident in the story itself. So the wise virgins planned for the long haul. They knew there could be a delay, so they have done something to ensure that they keep up at it over a longer period of time. Faith, loving action, perseverance. Now, Jesus tells these parables often as a corrective because people aren't thinking about things as they should, and so he teaches in a very creative and dynamic way to bring us back to center. I think this continues to happen today. When thinking about Jesus' return, our focus sometimes gets misplaced, and we think, we can get discouraged by the state of things in the world. And things are getting so bad, the love of many is growing cold. It's crazy out there, and the temptation is for us to run for the hills or to totally separate ourselves from the world that God loves. Craig Blomberg has written, "Perhaps we desperately want the world to be near its end so that we don't need to wrestle with the complex problems that plague our planet today." Maybe we just want to separate ourselves from the world God's love, but we know really in our heart of hearts that's not what Jesus calls us to do. There's also a temptation to focus too narrowly on the dates and the locations and the hyper-specific details of all these things, and many of which probably don't have much bearing on the return of Jesus at all, but people get obsessed with that stuff. There's a pretty popular meme that goes around. It's called the Charlie Day meme. It's from a movie. I forget which one. The Charlie Day meme, and like all good memes, it's got this picture and then the words at the bottom change based on the context. And there's ones for Christians based on the return of Jesus. Here it is. Christians trying to figure out the exact time Jesus returns. Look at how crazy this guy looks. Right? There's like all these papers on the wall. He's like all these, strings and markers. Like he's probably had 10 coffees. He's chain smoking cigarettes. Don't do that, by the way. But the thing is that this is sometimes how we can be. Do we want to look like that guy? Or do we want to look like faith, loving action, and perseverance? Theologian Don Carson has 3 helpful questions for us as we think about our posture as we await the return of Jesus, even as there seems to be, in our timing, a delay. He says, what would you like to be doing when Jesus returns? What would you like to be saying when Jesus returns? What would you like to be thinking about Jesus when Jesus returns? So again, those 3 words, what would you like to be doing, saying, thinking when Jesus returns? Friends, these are the kinds of things we need to be doing today. Here's why. Live today like you want to be living on the last day. Live today. Watch, be ready. It's about readiness. Live today like you want to be living on the last day. Would you say that with me? Live today like you want to be living on the last day. And I get it. This isn't about small details. It's not about whether or not you're shaved, whether or not you put on the right makeup, whether or not you've got that much coveted hat trick in hockey, whether or not you've vacuumed behind the couch, as nice as that is. This is about the big picture. A man named Jonathan lived in southern Manitoba, and Jonathan was recently retired. He was in his 60s. He had a visit with his doctor. They did some blood tests. A lovely man, and the doctor, who's known Jonathan a long time, says, "I'm so sorry. This is not good news. You've got a condition that, as far as we know, is incurable, so you probably have 2 years to live." Jonathan was shocked, as any of us would be. That's very difficult news to hear. He went home and obviously kind of had to gather himself, and it took several weeks. But when the shock of that news settled into his life, he really did fundamentally 3 things. And the first thing he did was call his brother, because he hadn't spoken to his brother in like 7, 8 years. and they had a family fight. It was a disagreement about property, family property. These things happen, and both sides said things. And Jonathan, he's accountable for himself, so he knows that he also said and did some things, and the manner that he used was not good. So he said, "Hey, I'm sorry." The second thing he did was pull out his Bible, because something he wanted to do for a long time is, I want to read the Bible cover to cover before I die. And now, as far as he knew, his life had an end date. So he started to read this Bible, and he started to come across this thing called prayer. And he realized he didn't know much about it, and so he got in touch with the local priest at a local small Anglican church that he'd been sometimes on special occasions when someone would invite him. And the priest, they had a great meeting, and he talked about prayer. And actually, Jonathan started to attend some worship services because he felt captivated by Jesus. The third thing he did was put his will together. And so he started to write his will. He didn't have any children. But recently there had been this call out in the community to help fund this after-school program. And they did a couple of things. They fed kids, they played games, but also based on the skill set of the volunteers, they had these little workshops for kids for learning stuff that they might not otherwise get to do. So sewing, knitting, small machines, those types of things. And so he knew that after his house sold, he'd have some money, and so he wanted to give some money to them. 2 weeks after his will was finished, he got a call from the doctor, "Jonathan, you need to come in here pretty quickly." And so let me tell you, when the doctor says that, you get in there fast. And so he goes in there and says, "Again, I'm so sorry. I ran the blood tests again. I got the results back. I couldn't believe it. I checked with a colleague. We made a mistake. You're not dying." Now, Jonathan was so incredibly happy, but he was so incredibly happy not because he wasn't dying, but because in preparing to meet his Maker, he learned how to be truly alive. He had never felt as happy and as at peace as he was in his preparations for his own death. Live today like you want to be living on the last day. And so Jonathan realized, I've got a second chance at this. And so not only did he call his brother, but he decided, you know what, I've got to take this further. I've got to live this. And so they made an appointment to meet for coffee. He started attending those services at the Anglican church and started learning more about Christ and thought, wait a second, I feel this faith thing coming alive in me in a new way. And then not only did he plan to give money to that after-school program, but he goes there one Tuesday evening a month, and he shares his own kind of a workshop, which is kind of woodworking projects like birdhouses and that sort of stuff, because that's a skill that he has. And so live today like you want to be living on that last day. So some days are bad, I get it. So this isn't about that. Some days we have one step forward, two step back. Some of you will be old enough to remember floppy disks that you could rewrite. And so sometimes we lie in bed at the end of the day and we're like, I wish I could rewrite the past 12 hours of my life. And I get it, we've all been there. So this isn't really about that. It's about big picture trajectory, right? Get out your firefighter work boots. Readiness, readiness, readiness. So, okay, if we want to live today like we want to be living on the last day, how do we do that? Oh, wait a second, we know. Faith, loving action, perseverance. So one final time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." The wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Klunk. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." So friends, live today like you want to be living on the last day. Faith, loving action, perseverance, to the glory of God. Amen.